Hello, and welcome to a new episode of When All Is Read and Done. I'm Amy.
And I'm Josh, and this is a podcast where we make sense of the world one book at a time. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. And if you're a regular listener, welcome back. So, Amy, what have you been reading or doing this week?
I have some great news. I feel like I kind of stole this from your Read and Done last week, but I received the first dose of my Pfizer vaccine this week.
Yay!
Yeah. So it was completely unplanned. I only drove my husband to his vaccination appointment, but they offered me one as well. And while I was there, I saw how healthcare workers and volunteers, they were keen to vaccinate as many people as possible with or without appointments. And for that, I'm just so thankful. And what about you, Josh? What have you been reading or doing this week?
So I just started reading Dragon Hoops by Luen, which is a graphic novel. I don't know if you know this about me, Amy, but I am a huge NBA fan. So Dragon Hoops is right up my alley. Gene writes about his experience as a high school teacher, and he chronicles the run of his small Californian school that they made to the state basketball championship. But similar to Superman Smashes the Klan, he uses it as a story to speak to deeper issues on race, religion, and discrimination. I just got started, but I'm really loving it so far. And also, I just need to throw this in that this week, there's this band called the Lindas.
Yeah.
And they blew up on social media because of this song that they wrote called A Racist, Sexist Boy. Have you heard it, Amy?
I haven't heard the song, but I know they're a group of very young girls, and it's a rock band, isn't it?
Yeah, they are, and they are just so cute. They're half Asian, half Latinx, and the song is really, really good. So it was something really fun that at least something nice blowing up on internet this week. So you should check them out as soon as you can. Amy, they are also on Spotify, so you can check out their album there. That's what I've been doing this week. In our last episode, we talked about how we've been burned by authors like Rowling, Whedon, and so I need to correct my pronunciation because it was brought to my attention that I pronounced his name wrongly, but Hergé, I believe. And whether we could separate art from the artist. And this is the follow-up episode to that, right? So if you haven't heard that one yet, you might want to do so before diving into this one. And so, Amy, why don't you tell our listeners what we're talking about in this follow-up episode?
Sure. So in this episode, we're going to dive into cancel culture. So as a book podcast, although it's very, very tempting, discussing cancel culture as a whole would be, beyond the scope of our podcast. What we're trying to do here is talk about cancel culture in publishing and our very small but very powerful readers community. Now, Josh, in our previous episode, you briefly mentioned that you didn't agree with the use of this term cancel culture. Could you maybe define this for us and tell us why you think the phrase in itself is problematic?
So that's a really loaded question, right? Thanks, Amy.
Yes, my pleasure.
So as a quick definition, cancel culture is the practice of calling out someone or shaming someone on social media because of something that they have said or done. It can often lead to being deplatformed, loss of reputation, or getting fired. Many view it as a powerful tool for protest. So I can see the attraction because it appears to democratize accountability, right? Many have used it to target bigots, racists, sexual predators, and companies with unethical practices. And those that maybe in the past would not have been held accountable in any sort of meaningful manner. Now, so you might say, Josh, that all may sound fabulous. So why would anyone find the term cancel culture problematic? And for me, there are a few reasons. The first one is that the term itself has roots in misogyny, right? So it comes from a phrase that was uttered by Wesley Snipes in the 1991 film New Jack City, where he says of his girlfriend, cancel that expletive, I'll buy another one. And I understand that phrases can evolve over time, but its association to misogyny like this makes me feel uneasy. And so if you're interested to learn more about the roots of cancel culture, where the term came from, we'll link to a fascinating article in our show notes from Vox titled The Second Wave of Cancel Culture. And secondly, I think a lot of it just feels performative.
Yeah.
Right? And so I agree with Jonah Bromwich, who wrote in a New York Times article titled Why Cancel Culture is a Distraction. And he says that the phrase cancel culture is too vague. It's a distraction from a deeper examination of power in society. And it no longer feels like a tool for the marginalized, right? Those who have been previously voiceless. In fact, a lot of the time, it feels performative, like the next thing to be outraged about. There is no space to breathe, and everything must be painted solely in black and white. And sometimes it feels like nobody wants to have a nuanced conversation on accountability, appropriate consequences, and rehabilitation anymore.
Mm-hmm.
When all that is being done is bombing someone out on social media, that to me personally barely qualifies as activism.
Mm-hmm.
And once it gets to the point where outrage is the norm, where everything is just down up to 11, what power does that outrage still possess?
Yeah, I completely agree with you on this. We live in an increasingly polarized world where the temperature in public discourse is high all the time. It feels like
Mm-hmm.
people have to take sides about everything. And coming back
Yeah.
to your point about cancel culture being a tool for marginalized groups to hold powerful people or corporations accountable, this has
Mm-hmm.
also been misused in so many ways, right? So, in a
Mm-hmm.
trial by social media or mob justice, as they say, there is no framework or due process for these accusations. So I heard a terrific New York Times coverage. So there was an article and also a podcast. It's about a network of websites where people can anonymously defame other people online by accusing them of being pedophiles, swindlers, or have STDs, whether
Mm-hmm.
or not this is true. So these websites, they have no legal obligation to investigate these accusations, nor any obligation to take these down. They also work symbiotically with reputation management services, which charge people thousands of dollars to have basically fabricated or fake news, trying to cancel them taken down.
Yeah, and this leads me to my biggest issue with cancel culture today. Like from a book's perspective, how exactly is this tool for accountability really holding stakeholders like publishers and authors accountable, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
when I see Simon and Schuster pulling out of distributing the book of the officer who shot Breonna Taylor, or canceling Josh Hawley's book deal after the events of January 6th because of immense public pressure, and I think, yeah, that's something that I can get behind. But then Howley's book immediately gets picked up by a conservative
Mm-hmm.
publishing house.
Yeah.
And let's be frank here, if your book is being published, you haven't been cancelled, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and also, Pence has two bloody book deals. Woody Allen's memoir gets dropped by Hachette but gets picked up by Arcade
Mm-hmm.
Publishing. Rolling was a massive hit during lockdown. Like the whole controversy didn't seem to affect her at all because she contributed significantly to the 27% growth in Bloomsbury's children division last year. And she had a glowing New York Times review for the Ichabod, which said
Mm-hmm.
that it possessed a sense of moral rectitude that leads us to suspect that all will come right in the end. Not bad for a turf, right?
Not bad at all.
Yeah, so I am all for holding people accountable. But what really is the end goal in holding publishers accountable? Many of us, I feel, are teetering on the bridge of outrage fatigue. And this is compounded, well, for me at least, by the feeling that it's all just shouting in the wind, especially when there doesn't seem to be any accountability or real repercussions resulting from the outrage.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not just about holding people accountable, but also cancel culture is so absolute and obliterative. There's no room to maneuver the nuances. Sometimes
Mm,
the punishment is completely disproportionate to the so-called crime. And
mhm.
conversely, as you've just illustrated, sometimes the offenders end up profiting from the attention that the
Mm,
cancellation has created. So
yeah.
where is the accountability there? I've previously talked about how I personally felt about Rowling and her tweets. I mentioned that I wouldn't support her future work, but people like Rowling, should they completely be deplatformed or demonetized for voicing their opinions? This is such a tricky
Mm,
question because who gets to determine what's appropriate and what's not? And who
yeah.
gets to draw the line in the sand that, okay, here is where it's a touch too far. But before that, it's absolutely fine. So,
Yeah.
like I said in our previous episode, I would draw the line when your views are harmful or hateful towards a particular group. So I would personally not buy Rowling's books or promote Harry Potter on a public platform. But at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, I also do not feel like it's my place to condemn someone if they do. your relationship with authors, your views, and what you do with your money is your personal choice. So, listeners, I don't think I would judge you by your bookshelf. But where do you stand on this, Josh?
I would definitely judge people by their bookshelf. but there's levels to it, right? So, for example, there was a recent controversy surrounding a local Malaysian publisher whose co-founder wrote an extremist manifesto calling for the killing of Malay liberals and people from the non-Malay community, all while referencing Nazi pogroms. And after the publisher decided to double down in defending those hateful ideas, I think it isn't difficult to decide what to do in that situation, whether you want to continue supporting them or not. But Amy, what if I were to go on a date with someone and they said, "Oh, I just picked up Harry Potter and it's so good." And I think my reaction would be different from if the same person said, "You know what gets me hot? Mike Pence's autobiography."
Would you really not date someone if they had the hots for Mike Pence? Mike Pence started his political career as a radio host, which isn't so different from modern day podcaster like yourself, eh?
Okay, well, yeah, I am a Christian with a podcast that talks about current issues, so I'm definitely a Mike Pence in the making.
I can see it.
God, please, God, no. Yeah, if I were dating someone that was hot for Pence, that would probably be a deal breaker, right? But I just want to quickly touch on the point about criticism here. It increasingly feels like criticism and cancellation has been conflated to the point where it's difficult to distinguish between the two anymore. It feels like if there are valid criticisms of an author's work these days, be it cultural appropriation, sexism, the use of racist stereotypes, then the immediate response seems to be they should be cancelled.
Yep, it feels like that.
Yeah, and we're going to link an article, a really good one that I found titled "A Feminist Critique of Murakami Novels" with Murakami himself. And in it, the Japanese author Miko Kawakami, she sits down with Murakami and she critiques his use of sexist tropes in his The Wind-Up Bird Chronicles and 1Q84. But she doesn't just break down those tropes and how they could be harmful, especially to women. She contrasts them with female characters that he has depicted wonderfully and humanely in the past, such as the protagonist in Sleep from the Elephant Vanishes, or Reiko and Hatsumi in Norwegian Wood, right? Which is a book I love, and which is also known as the book that proves Josh doesn't only read graphic novels, okay? But, social media, though, doesn't allow for that kind of nuance. Everything is black or white.
Yep.
When we talk about cancel culture and bringing up Rowling or Hergé, these are the most egregious examples, right?
Yep.
But there are other circumstances where it would be much better if we could have a conversation rather than be purely two camps, where you're either I stand author X, screw the haters, or author X is the worst and their book needs to be banished forever.
Yep.
So, Amy, you asked about where I would draw the line. I think I agree with you. That's when a writer or publisher profit off actions which have deliberately hurt others. Now, I don't know how many people are actively buying Harry Potter to stick it to the liberals. And I also understand the argument that you cannot or should not repress free speech, and that there's a danger in gatekeeping what does or does not get published. But if publishers profit by providing a platform to people who have subverted democracy or called for the eradication of a certain people group, or who have straight up murdered people, I find that really hard to accept. But what do you do, right, in that kind of situation?
Yeah, that's fair. You also make a great point about gatekeeping and who gets to determine what does or does not get published. Publishers are in and of themselves. They're private corporations. So how much power should these private corporations should be able to have to hold in determining who is acceptable to publish? So when J.K. Rowling, she expressed her transphobic views, young employees at Hachette, especially in their 20s and 30s, they opposed working on the Ikebok. And in the past decade, employees, they're increasingly aware of their right to work in a safe environment where they do not feel discriminated against based on their race, sexuality, or gender. And I can completely empathize with feeling vulnerable working in a publishing house that profits off books by authors like Woody Allen or Rowling, when you disagree so strongly with their personal views or their poor behavior. But on the other side of the coin, publishers argue that freedom of speech is the cornerstone of publishing. They want to appear politically neutral as an entity, and they never comment on their authors' personal views. But is it too much to ask when employees demand their essentially apolitical employers to weigh in on what are essentially political issues?
No, I don't think that it is. And this might contradict a little bit what we have been saying, that everything has to be black and white. But it does feel in the current climate that being apolitical is also a political choice. I applaud the courage it takes to be willing to speak up when you believe your employer is in the wrong. And at the end of the day, though, for these publishers, it really is an economic decision. In a lockdown, if selling Harry Potter books brings a boost to Bloomsbury, that's what they're going to do, right? And the obligation to any sense of morality, I think, comes a distant second to the bottom line. And that's what it comes back to, right, at the end of the day. If I truly believe in something, I need to put my money where my mouth is. But what does that actually look like? So it can go from the personal, where I stopped buying Rowling's books, to holding protests against Bloomsbury for continuing to publish Rowling. And also, would it be fair to punish the entirety of Bloomsbury for what was probably decided in a room by a small group of people whose primary concern is profits? I don't know, right? And as we wrap up, I want to very quickly touch on bookstores here. So recently, a few major bookstores in Malaysia caved to online pressure by a few outspoken bigots who demanded that a queer graphic novel named Heartstopper by Alice Oseman be removed from their shelves. And one of these bookstores, without a hint of irony, did so the same week it launched a campaign to diversify your reads.
Gosh.
And yeah, it illustrates how cancel culture has morphed into a double-edged sword that can be wielded by both activists and bigots alike, right?
Again, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head there. Although right-wing politicians, they like to berate cancel culture, and they say that liberals use this to suppress their freedom of speech, they have also conveniently weaponized cancel culture when it suits their agenda, haven't they? Like the Heartstopper hoo-ha was a terrific example set locally in Malaysia. But, there are also books like Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale and George Orwell's Animal Farm. And they also have interesting stories of cancellation that may seem absurd to us, but are completely justified in the minds of some other groups. We can probably do an entire episode of banned books if we want to.
Oh, yeah. Like The Hate You Give as well, right? Another book that was a huge outcry about that. Yeah, but that's a topic that we can probably tackle another day. But coming back to the bookstores, what do we do? Like, do you run a petition to get Heartstopper back on their shelves? Shame the bookstores on social media? I know some people have been doing that.
Yep.
Boycott the bookstore completely. So again, I think in this situation, you will need to decide what is right for you, and maybe act in a way that goes beyond something performative.
You really gave our listeners a lot to think about today. And that is a strong point to conclude our episode on. When planning this episode, I was trying to read books specifically about cancel culture, but then they all just turned out to be authors who've been canceled for like sexual misconduct or saying problematic things, and then are trying to uncancel themselves by criticizing cancel culture. So my RADRec for this episode will be a book that I read last year by Nesrine Malik. She's a columnist for The Guardian, and the book is called We Need New Stories. This book busts some myths about gender equality, identity politics, and other sort of right-wing propaganda. But it also has two interesting chapters, in my opinion, on the myth of political correctness and the myth of free speech. So these chapters, they predate the cancel culture conversation, but I think they still make good points about the issues that we've discussed today. So another very, very interesting perspective, I think, is John Ronson's So You've Been Publicly Shamed. So the title alone,
right?
The title alone is just like, I gotta have this book. So in this book, Ronson interviews people who have been canceled, and it is a very interesting look into how debilitating this can be.
Yeah, I think when we talk about something like cancel culture, it's very easy to put on a binary lens, right? Where everything has to be right or wrong with nothing in between. So it's difficult, but we should try to make sure that we ourselves aren't caught in an echo chamber of performative wokeness. I've started reading Meghan Daum's The Problem with Everything, My Journey Through the New Culture Wars, where she provides the perspective of a Gen Xer who cannot stand what she calls intolerance, self-righteous wokeness, and narcissism repackaged as revolution. So I don't know whether this is something that you or any of our listeners might want to read, but I thought that I'll give it a try in hopes that I'll be able to gain a different perspective and see if it helps me reconcile how I feel about cancel culture as a whole. If nothing else, it should be an entertaining read, I hope.
So if you liked this episode, do subscribe to When All Is Read and Done on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you would like to support us, please rate, review, or share this episode with a friend or a loved one. This would really help our little podcast grow and reach new listeners.
We would love to hear your feedback and comments on this episode or any topics you would like for us to cover in future ones. You can reach us either on Instagram at readanddone or via email at readanddonepod@gmail.com. That's it for this episode. Bye, everyone.
See you next time.